There was a man Shaquille O'Neal kept seeing at a restaurant in New Jersey. Not once, not twice, for years. The man would sit there quietly, sometimes emotional, sometimes looking like he was carrying a secret too heavy to say out loud. Shaq noticed him, but he never knew who he was. And that is the part of this story that feels almost impossible to believe, because the man sitting only a few tables away from one of the most famous athletes on earth was not a fan. He was not a reporter. He was not some stranger hoping for a picture. He was Shaq's biological father. A father Shaq had not seen since before he could remember. A father who had disappeared when Shaq was still a baby. A father Shaq had spent most of his life refusing to chase. And for years, that man had been less than 40 blocks away from the neighborhood Shaq knew. Not across the world. Not hidden in another country. Not impossible to find. 40 blocks. That means Shaq did not just grow up without his biological father. He grew up close enough to him that they could have crossed paths at any time. And eventually, they did. In 2016, Shaquille O'Neal sat across from Toney, the man whose name was on his origin story, but not in his childhood. Joe looked at him and said something simple, something ordinary, something that should have been said decades earlier. He told Shaq he was his daddy. And Shaq, a 7'1" giant who had bullied the strongest men in basketball, suddenly had to face something no championship ring could protect him from. The question he had buried for more than 40 years, why did you leave? But to understand why that restaurant meeting mattered so much, you have to understand the secret Shaq discovered when he was only 11 years old. Because until then, he thought he already had a father. For the first 11 years of his life, Shaquille O'Neal believed Phillip Harrison was his biological dad. Phillip was the man in the house. Phillip was the man giving orders. Phillip was the man at the practices. Phillip was the man correcting him, pushing him, disciplining him, and making sure that a restless kid from Newark did not drift into the wrong life. Phillip Harrison was an army sergeant, and he ran the house like one. There was structure. There were rules. There were consequences. There was no softness when Shaq needed direction. To a child, that can feel harsh, but to Shaq, it became the foundation of everything. The world would later see the funny Shaq, the smiling Shaq, the commercial Shaq, the man dancing on television, joking with Charles Barkley, making crowds laugh without even trying. But before all of that, there was a boy being trained by a military father who believed greatness required discipline before applause. Shaq did not question it. Why would he? Children do not ask for birth certificates. They do not study family paperwork. They believe the person showing up every day is the person who belongs there. Then one day, at 11 years old, Shaq noticed something small. His siblings had different last names. That tiny detail cracked open the whole story. The man he called Dad was not his biological father. He was his stepfather. His real biological father was Toney, a talented high school basketball player who once had his own future in front of him. Joe had ability. He had promise. He had been good enough for people to believe basketball might take him somewhere. But addiction and trouble got there first. When Shaq was still an infant, Joe was sent to prison. And after that, he did not return to build a life with his son. He gave up his parental rights. That phrase sounds clean on paper. Legal, formal, administrative. But for a child, it means something much heavier. It means someone had a choice, and the choice was not you. That is the emotional wound hiding underneath Shaq's public story. Because yes, he had Phillip. Yes, he had a man who raised him. Yes, he had discipline, love, structure, and protection. But a biological father walking away still leaves a question behind. And even if the child grows up strong, rich, famous, loved, and powerful, that question can still sit quietly in the corner of the room. Why was I not enough for you to stay? Shaq did not build his life around weakness. He built it around force. By 13, he was already bigger than most grown men. By 16, he was nearly impossible to ignore. In San Antonio, at Robert G. Cole High School, he became a teenager who looked like he had been dropped into the wrong age group by mistake. Other kids played basketball. Shaq changed the weather in the gym. He was too big, too strong, too physical. He led his team to a state championship. He collected rebounds like the ball belonged to him personally. And every time he dominated another game, Phillip Harrison's voice was behind it. Keep going. Stay focused. Do not get comfortable. Do not let praise make you soft. Phillip did not raise Shaq to be impressed with himself. He raised him to work. That is why one of the most important scenes in Shaq's life did not happen in an NBA arena. It happened years earlier on a military base in Germany. Because Phillip's Army career moved the family around, Shaq's childhood was not settled in one place. Newark, Germany, Texas. Different homes, different schools, different environments. But one move put him in the path of Dale Brown, the LSU basketball coach. Brown saw a young giant on a base in Germany and eventually helped open the door to LSU. Think about that. The same military life that could have made Shaq feel unstable ended up placing him in front of one of the people who would change his future. That is the strange pattern of his story. The absence of one father created pain. The presence of another father created direction. At LSU, Shaq became more than a tall kid. He became a force. Two-time All-American, SEC Player of the Year, National College Star, a body nobody could move, and a personality nobody could ignore. Then in 1992, the Orlando Magic selected him first overall in the NBA draft. Just like that, the boy who once did not know the full truth about his own father became the face of a franchise. But fame does not heal everything. Money does not erase abandonment. Applause does not answer old questions. And being loved by millions does not automatically repair the pain of not being claimed by one person. That is why Shaq's relationship with Toney stayed frozen for so long. Shaq did not chase him. He did not beg for answers. He did not build his public identity around sadness. In fact, he did the opposite. He made his position clear in music. On his 1994 track, Biological Didn't Bother, Shaq drew the line in public. The message was simple. Phil was his father. Not Joe. Phil. And that mattered because Shaq was not just saying who raised him, he was saying who had earned the title. Fatherhood in Shaq's mind was not biology. It was attendance. It was discipline. It was sacrifice. It was the man who woke up, stayed, corrected, protected, and carried responsibility when it was not easy. Joe gave him life. Phillip gave him direction. And for years, Shaq believed that was the end of the story. Then came Los Angeles. When Shaq signed with the Lakers in 1996, he was no longer just a star. He was becoming a cultural event. The contract was massive. The spotlight was brutal. The expectations were suffocating. In Orlando, he had been the young giant. In Los Angeles, he had to become a champion. And on his back, he wore number 34. That number was not random. It was connected to Phillip Harrison, the man who had shaped him, the man who had pushed him, the man whose military discipline had become part of Shaq's competitive identity. So while the world watched Shaq dominate the NBA, he was carrying his father with him. Not his biological father, his real father. The one who showed up. The Lakers' years turned Shaq into something almost mythological. He was not graceful in the way smaller players were graceful. He was terrifying. When he caught the ball near the rim, defenders did not look like opponents. They looked like furniture being moved out of the way. Double teams came. Triple teams came. Teams used fouls as a survival tactic. The league had to adjust to him because normal basketball logic did not apply. From 2000 to 2002, the Lakers won 3 straight championships. Shaq was Finals MVP all 3 times. For most people, that would be the complete story. A poor kid makes it. A broken family becomes motivation. A dominant athlete reaches the top, roll credits. But real life does not end at the parade. Because after the confetti falls, the person still has to go home with whatever questions success could not answer. And Shaq still had one. Somewhere out there was Toney, the man who had left. The man who had become a lyric, a boundary, a chapter Shaq did not want reopened. And then, in 2013, Phillip Harrison died. That loss changed the emotional math of Shaq's life. Because as long as Phillip was alive, the answer felt simple. I have a father. I do not need another one. But when Phillip was gone, the old question started breathing again. It does not mean Shaq loved Phillip any less. It means grief can open doors a person has spent decades holding shut. His mother eventually suggested he should reach out to Joe. At first, that idea must have felt almost impossible. What do you say to a man who missed everything? You missed the little boy. You missed the teenage years. You missed the LSU rise. You missed draft night. You missed Orlando. You missed the championships. You missed the pain, the pressure, the divorce, the growth, the children, the whole transformation. You missed the life. But Shaq agreed. An uncle helped track Joe down, and what they discovered made the story even more painful. Joe had not been impossible to find. He had been close, less than 40 blocks away. And more than that, he had been living in the same building as a restaurant Shaq already knew. A restaurant where Shaq had eaten. A restaurant where Shaq had seen a man crying. A man he walked past without knowing the connection. Imagine finding out that the father you never met was not some distant ghost. He was a face in a room you had already entered. That is not just absence. That is proximity, and proximity makes absence hurt differently. Because it forces the mind to ask a crueler question. If you were that close, why did it still take 40 years? When Shaq finally sat across from Joe in 2016, the meeting could have gone many ways. It could have become an argument. It could have become a confrontation. It could have become a son finally unloading every question he had swallowed since childhood. But Shaq did something more complicated. He listened. He admitted he was upset. How could he not be? A casual greeting cannot cover decades of silence. A few words cannot replace birthdays, practices, advice, protection, or presence. But Shaq also refused to let anger own the room. He told Joe he did not hate him. That sentence sounds simple, but it carries a lifetime inside it. Because forgiveness is not always a dramatic hug with music playing underneath. Sometimes it is a tired adult choosing not to carry the same weight anymore. Shaq did not need Joe to become Phillip. That would have been impossible. Phillip had already earned his place. Phillip had already done the work. Phillip had already raised the boy. Joe was not returning to replace him. Joe was returning to answer the empty space. And Shaq, older now, had lived enough life to understand failure differently. That is one of the most honest parts of his story. Shaq has spoken publicly about his own mistakes as a husband and father. He has admitted that fame, ego, and infidelity damaged his marriage. He has not tried to paint himself as perfect. And maybe that made the meeting with Joe more complicated. Because when you are young, it is easy to divide people into heroes and villains. The person who stayed is good. The person who left is bad. But age makes the picture harder. You start to understand that people can fail badly and still be human. You start to understand that regret can live inside someone for decades. You start to understand that forgiveness is not the same as pretending nothing happened. Shaq did not erase the past. He just stopped letting the past control the rest of the story. That is why the restaurant scene matters. Not because it gave us a perfect Hollywood ending. It did not. It matters because one of the strongest men in sports had to sit across from the one weakness he could never dunk on. Abandonment. There is a reason this story hits harder than in normal sports biography. because it is not really about Shaq. It is about the difference between the person who gives you life and the person who teaches you how to live. Toney gave Shaq a name and a bloodline. Phillip Harrison gave him a standard. Joe's absence became a question. Phillip's presence became an answer. That answer followed Shaq everywhere. It followed him into El Soo. It followed him into Orlando. It followed him into Los Angeles. It followed him into the championship years. It followed him into fatherhood, business, television, and the public image of the smiling giant everybody thinks they know. But behind that smile was a man who understood something many people never say out loud. Sometimes the person who shaped you most is not the person connected to you by blood. It is the person who stayed when staying was work. Phillip was not perfect. Shaq himself has described him as strict, hard, and from a different era. Some of his methods would be questioned today. But in Shaq's life, Phillip became the wall between chaos and discipline. He taught Shaq not to fear pressure. He taught him not to worship trophies. He taught him that talent without control can destroy itself. And maybe that is why Shaq's gratitude toward him was never quiet. He honored him publicly. He wore his number. He gave him financial support when success arrived. He made it clear over and over again that Phillip was the father who mattered. That is the emotional center of this story. Shaq did not forgive Joe because Joe earned the same place as Phillip. He forgave Joe because Phillip had already given Shaq enough strength to do it. Read that again in your own life. Sometimes the person who helps you forgive someone is not the person who hurt you. It is the person who loved you properly afterward. Shaq's life could have gone in a different direction. A baby born in Newark. A young mother alone. A biological father in prison. A childhood full of moves. A body too big to hide inside ordinary rooms. A temper and energy that needed somewhere to go. That story could have ended quietly. It could have ended badly. It could have become another life swallowed by the same streets and systems that swallowed so many others. But then, Phillip Harrison stepped in. He did not just raise Shaq. He redirected him. And that is what makes the final image so powerful. A 7'1" champion sitting in a New Jersey restaurant across from the man who left. No basketball, no crowd, no scoreboard, no referees, no teammates, no cameras needed, just a son and a father trying to understand what time had taken from them. For Joe, maybe that meeting was a chance to be seen as more than the mistake that defined him. For Shaq, maybe it was a chance to stop fighting a ghost. And for everyone watching from the outside, it becomes a question. Who really gets to be called father? The person whose name is written on paper? Or the person whose presence is written into your character? Shaq's answer seems clear. Blood can explain where you came from. But presence explains who you became. That is why this story is not about Joe replacing Phillip. It is about Shaq becoming whole enough to hold both truths at once. One man left. One man stayed. One wound remained. One foundation held. And in the end, Shaq did not have to choose bitterness to prove loyalty. He could honor Phillip completely and still release his anger toward Joe. That is maturity. That is grief. That is peace. Not the clean, easy kind. The earned kind. The kind that takes 40 years. So when people talk about Shaquille O'Neal, they usually talk about size. 7'1", 300+ pounds. Backboard shaking. Defenders bouncing off him. 4 championships. 3 finals MVPs. One of the most dominant players the sport has ever seen. But the biggest thing about Shaq was never his body. It was the space he had to make inside himself. Space for the father who raised him. Space for the father who fielded him. Space for the boy who once discovered the truth by noticing a last name. Space for the man who could finally sit across a restaurant table and say, without pretending the past was okay, I do not hate you. That is not weakness. That is strength, at full size, because anyone can hold a grudge when they have a good reason. The harder thing is knowing when the grudge has finished its job. Shaq carried the pain long enough. Then he put it down. And maybe that is the part of his legacy people should talk about more. Not just the dunks, not just the rings, not just the jokes, not just the television personality, but the boy who was abandoned, raised, disciplined, celebrated, broken open by grief, and finally strong enough to forgive without rewriting history. Shaquille O'Neal's story is not simply the story of a basketball legend. It is the story of a man who learned that fatherhood is not proven by biology, it is proven by presence. And it is the story of what can happen when the door you swore would stay closed forever opens anyway. Not because the person who hurt you deserves an easy ending, but because you deserve a lighter one. So here's the question. Is there someone in your life you have already written off forever? Someone whose absence shaped you more than you admit? Someone you do not need back, but maybe still need peace from? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Because this story is bigger than Shaq. It is about every person who had to grow around an empty space. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe for more emotional stories behind the famous faces we think we already know. Because sometimes the most powerful part of a legend is not what happened under the lights. It is what happened years later at a quiet table when the crowd was gone and the strongest man in the room finally faced the one question he could not overpower.